And do you like to kind of capture a natural kind of expression of the scene, or are you more artistic with your capture of that?
I would say, in general, I think my approach tends to be more realistic in the context of accurately conveying the scene, but doing so creatively. So finding an interesting angle, waiting for the right moment in terms of lighting. And, you know, one of the photographers that I worked with very early in my career, George Lepp, would talk about the difference between an amateur photographer and a professional photographer was the size of their trash can. Now, this is way back in the early days when we would capture images on film instead of with a digital camera. And so, of course, he's referring to all those slides you're throwing away. And there's certainly an element of truth. If I put together a portfolio of my best images from the Palouse, I have some images that I'm very proud of that I think turned out very well. I also have tens of thousands of photos from the Palouse that I could probably just as well delete that aren't going to win any prizes. And so, there's certainly an element of, it takes practice to get great photos. And, you're going to hopefully be improving as a photographer over time and improving the opportunities you create for yourself in terms of travel or which whatever that means, right? I happen to live now outside of Nashville, Tennessee, so I don't have to travel very far to get to the Great Smoky Mountains, for example, or I can fly over to Europe and visit the Alps. And so it doesn't have to be going really far. It's just giving yourself the opportunity with subjects that resonate with you, that are photographically interesting or visually interesting, and then finding what works for you. So I don't tend to get, what I would think of as being wildly creative, other than hopefully composing a good image and finding an interesting angle, an interesting vantage point, and considering camera settings, things like depth of field, and some long exposures, some high dynamic range imaging. But I don't do a lot of I guess you could say more extreme creativity. I'll do some motion blurs and some panning blurs and whatnot, but that's really the minority. Usually, I tend to focus on a more as it appeared in front of my eyes type of photograph, just made interesting by hopefully really great conditions and the right composition, the right amount of depth of field, all those sorts of things that are, kind of the more classic, I suppose you could say, approach to photography.
And I would guess kind of a lot of that came from your film days, right? With those kind of techniques.
Very much so. And, obviously the digital side of it didn't exist when I first got started in photography. And, there was there Photoshop even around? I don't think, when I first got into photography, I don't think Photoshop actually existed. So, there was certainly this element of you had to get it right in the camera. And if you messed it up, you were wasting film. And, as a high school student, or as I got a little bit older, actually the notion of spending, $10 on a roll of film and $10 to get the film processed, or, whatever the case, well, in high school I was processing my own film, but, there was an element of putting an investment into it. And then it's a mystery, which can be good and bad, but you don't know what you're getting until the film is processed. You don't really have an image until you successfully develop the film. And so that put a lot of pressure on getting it right in the camera. And I think it's one of the reasons I'm really grateful that I'm old enough that my start in photography was with film, is that it taught me to be very aware, to really understand my camera, to understand exposure, and to try to make sure that I was considering composition, creativity and all these things at the time of capture, because once I left, I was losing that opportunity. And with digital, there's a little bit less of that, right? I mean, there certainly are situations we might put ourselves in where we have limited time. I remember, for example, a trip to Easter Island. I was really fortunate to have had the opportunity to teach on board a cruise ship that was going to be stopping for 2 days at Easter Island. And so that gave me essentially 2 outings, 2 opportunities to get ashore and try and get the shots. And one of the sort of top photographic destinations on Easter Island is this quarry where there's quite a few of the Moai statues scattered around. And there's sort of the one most famous view or little location, this cluster of a handful of these Moai statues. And so when I was walking along this hillside by this volcano and this quarry, I knew tomorrow is too late. So I have to get the shot today. And thankfully, the weather was cooperating. It was really hot, but that's Easter Island for you. But there were some nice clouds in the sky, good overall lighting conditions. I didn't have the luxury of sunrise or sunset, unfortunately, based on our schedule limitations. But, as I was standing there in front of these statues, I'm thinking, I really have to get this right. I've got to find the right position, which, part of that mentality, as I mentioned, comes from that notion of wasting film, but also just the fact that I'm not going to be able to come back tomorrow. So, and Easter Island is far away from everything. So if I want to come back, it's certainly an ordeal. And so I was really focused, more so than usual, on trying to make sure that I was getting a good composition. And, it became a more almost sort of frantic experience in that regard. Whereas I'm a pretty, laid back guy, so I don't stress out about, a lot of stuff in general. But when I'm photographing in sort of an everyday location, I lived in New York City for something like, close to 10 years. And so I knew that, the iconic buildings and bridges and whatnot, they're always there. I can, go photograph them tomorrow if the weather doesn't work out right today. But when you have that scarcity of time, knowing that, in the case of Easter Island, it's now or never is, really kind of how it felt, puts that added pressure on you, which is, good and bad. But that's how we grow as photographers, I feel, is by, having a little bit of pressure, pushing ourselves a little bit beyond our comfort zone.